CGTN, China Global Television Network.
We have made the decision that it is not intelligent for 54 of us to go and sit before one gentleman from another place. And sometimes we are mistreated.
Yeah.
You know, we are loaded into buses like school kids.
That was Kenyan President William Ruto demanding respect from world leaders in a recent meeting. Other African leaders also made strong comments in their exchanges with Western counterparts. So, is Africa pushing back? This week, we analyze this trend and discuss why African leaders are openly unhappy with some of their Western counterparts. I'm Beatrice Marshall. Welcome to Talk Africa. To discuss this issue, let's now bring in our panel of experts. Joining in from Nairobi, Ambassador Boaz Mbaya, former Kenyan ambassador to the African Union and former permanent secretary in the Ministry of Kenya's Foreign Affairs. From Kampala, Joseph Ochieno, African Affairs commentator. And in Johannesburg, J. Brooks Spector, international relations expert and former U.S. diplomat. A very warm welcome to you all and thank you for being a part of this discussion. Let me start off with you, Brooks Spector. We just heard the sentiments of the Kenyan President William Ruto, which is what he said again at a recent meeting in South Africa, where he said, and I quote, "Some of the people who invite us to these meetings tell us if we do not accept, there will be consequences." As a U.S. diplomat, what do you make of this?
Well, I make of it a couple of things. Each country, each government obviously has to watch out for its own interests and has to be able to articulate its own policies. As a practical matter, it is really very hard for one government to meet sequentially the heads of 53 or 54 other countries in one meeting and have any sort of larger discussion take place. A meeting of 54 or 55 people is a parliament and not a meeting. But I want to broaden out the discussion ever so slightly and say I think there are three different versions of the question that you're raising. One is the government to government version. One is the question of larger principles at stake. And a third, of course, is the people of those countries rather than the governments. And I think in each category there is somewhat of a different view.
I want to come back though.
Government officials, senior government officials may well
yeah, Brooks Spector, I want to come back to that, what you're discussing, and specifically look at how African leaders have been looking at their relationship with their Western counterparts. It's not on an equal footing, is it?
Well, no. I mean, I'm not making the point that it is a one-to-one equality. Some countries are larger and more consequential, and some countries are less so. Let's be fair. The head of a government of a Kenya or a Nigeria or a South Africa or perhaps a Senegal carries more weight in world affairs than does the head of state or the head of government in Eswatini or Malawi or Gambia. It may not be fair, but consider the same version of things. The government of Luxembourg or Liechtenstein doesn't carry the same weight as France, Germany, or England. So, and that's the nature of the reality of our respective societies.
So let's look at this a bit more. Joseph, I want to get your perspective here. Having listened to President Ruto and what Brooks Spector has just said, from what you know, is this characteristic of Africa's relationship with some of its Western counterparts?
It's interesting, the observations coming from Ambassador Brooks. No, it is the case that Africa has been sometimes treated as one country, and we're a continent of very sophisticated, powerful civilizations, but broken in pieces over several years. President Ruto was absolutely right, I think, to get infuriated But one of the reasons why I was rather interested in his reaction was that perhaps unless and until some of these exposures of trips in buses in London come up, it's very rarely the case that African leaders, particularly the generation between founding parents and the contemporary generation, I think sort of they lost out in some of their own purposes. And so in a way, it was a bit of a shock of some of the realities, including those bus bundle journeys that woke up leaders like President Ruto. But it's the case anyway, isn't it, that our early founding parents, the Sengos of this world, the Kaundas, the Nyereres, the Obotes, and indeed perhaps the Lumumbas in a very short period of time, and perhaps the thinking of the likes of the Sisulus of those days, although they didn't have those mantles pre-Mandela, were very considered individual African leaders in their respective bilateral positions, but very contextually conscious as African leaders representing a grouping of peoples, just as the ambassador said that when you talk about other leaders, you know that whether it's a Norwegian leader or Luxembourg leader, they're heads of state and representatives of their own governments, and they needed to be treated in such regard, regardless of the reality of the bilateral relations that might exist between the two countries or two parties, and that is the issue.
Ambassador Mbaye, I want to hear your perspective on this, because as an African diplomat, what's been your experience? I mean, what have been the major challenges that African countries face in their diplomatic engagements with global powers?
Well, thank you very much. I'm interested in what Ambassador is saying, but from a different point of view. One, I think we need to start from the definition of what a state is. What are the factors that go into establishment and recognition of a state? And once we have established that, which is that once recognized so, a state has rights, it has duties, it has obligations. It does not make a distinction between a large state or a small state. It makes only the fact that that particular state has a right and duty and an obligation to take its own decisions without any reference to anybody else, any other authority. So we find it very strange these days when America, United States, imposes sanctions on a country, and then it gives a caveat and says any other country that violates those sanctions will be punished. Which law are we using, United States, or are we using international law? And if you're using international law recognizes the equality and sovereignty of states equally, whether it is a big state or a small state. I understand what Ambassador is saying, but the reality is that there is no way you're going to huddle 54 heads of state into a bus and ask them to speak for 1.5 minutes in a meeting where the United States takes the majority of the time, with the secretaries of state, secretaries of treasury, and other state officers addressing heads of state as if they're actually students in a classroom. So there is a problem, and I think African leaders are now emerging to assert themselves. I'm very happy with what is happening, actually.
All right, because Ambassador Mbaye, I was going to ask you, then why do African leadership attend these meetings if, as you say, it only, they have like a minute and a half to make their points? Why do they attend these meetings?
They attend meetings because of cooperation. One wants to advance cooperation with the rest of international actors. We want to believe we can take part in meetings involving the United States, involving China, France, involving Russia, without preconditions. We should go there knowing that our participation is really intended to encourage and enhance international cooperation. You can only do that in a multilateral setup. You can only do that where you are able to marshal your resources to address a particular problem. But we cannot accept, I think, a situation where you're going to handle heads of state in a bus. We saw it during the funeral of Queen Elizabeth. Right. We saw it in the United States. It doesn't look good for the citizens of those countries where the heads of state are actually huddled in a bus. It looks like they are inferior to the host president. So we have to acknowledge the fact that sovereignty means equality, and equality must mean just that.
All right, Brooke Spencer, let me come back to you here, because this seemingly new nature of African diplomacy, I mean, have these pushbacks, though, been effective? Can this change the dynamics between Africa and traditional partners?
Well, I mean, the pushback, if you want to call it that, obviously has had something of an effect on American diplomacy. Now, remember, we're weighing the diplomacy of this administration against the diplomacy of the previous one, and the previous one had a well-known and not particularly well-appreciated view about Africa and the nations therein, and the Biden administration is taking a different position on this. Now, I don't think I want to comment on whether or not people were packed in a bus for the funeral of Queen Elizabeth or not. Maybe you can ask somebody from Britain about that one. But I've been to international meetings where there were a large number of participants, and the only feasible way to get them to the central point was through common transportation, except when you were talking about someone whose security apparatus comes with them in a couple of closed vehicles and a follow car and so forth and so forth. But I think if you look at the way, let's say, the African Union has a presence globally and internationally, which is much different than would have been the case with the old Organization of African Unity. Because I think it is increasingly premised on the idea that there are real as opposed to symbolic issues at stake. There are reasons to have meetings and representations, in the same way that the All Africa Free Trade Association, theoretically, although not yet in practical terms, has a real as opposed to simply a symbolic or semiotic kind of meaning.
Right.
And that changes the dynamic to some degree. There will always be meetings between a president and a president and a president and a group of states, simply because it's simply not easy to handle 150 or 193 bilateral meetings. If you remember at the UN at the opening of the General Assembly, every head of state gets a couple of minutes and that's it.
All right. So, Joseph, I'm really interested in getting your perspective here. Brooke Spector talks about the logistics of the situation necessitating certain issues to be put in place here. But do you feel, though, that the pushbacks from African countries, are they changing the dynamics between Africa and traditional partners?
I think actually most of our independence leaders were slightly much more robust about some of the situations, except they were divided. And remember, it was actually a Cold War time. There was an element of a loss and a lost opportunity, particularly when China began to emerge, that I think our leaders are basically simply waking up at the moment. I can pick quick examples. The position taken by the Ghanaian president when the French president was visiting, that was seen to be new, special, and exceptional. So really many of these things are so new, but actually they should be routines. These are conversations we should be having 30 years ago, not today. Right. The positions taken by the South African president, Cyril Ramaphosa, once in a while, on many of these other issues, including today, is rather bold and rather impressive, except they're still, you know, if you like, they're still scattered, actually considered the 54 nations. So our friends elsewhere, particularly the West, should not really complain so much. You know, President Mbeki was rather impressive. Not only was he taking the position that, well, we are Africans and we are taking a position and we are South African and we are new, but actually that we need to be able to be new with something else. Hence the emergence of the discussions around the new partnership for African development, meaning putting the economic thing, putting the policy thing, putting the identity thing, rejiggling strategically so that not only do we come together as a continent, but where our new relations, you see the emergence of BRICS and the general impact on it. I don't think this conversation gets sufficient attention, and conversation, particularly at a much more critical level, both politically, policy, and really with the ordinary citizens of this continent. And in the event that actually that happened, I think our friends elsewhere will likely begin to realize that actually Africa is genuinely waking up and awaken, and actually maybe with that we shall begin to be having genuine conversations about our strategic location, so that if a strategic location is a question about something in the Cape, it's not only for South Africa, but if inevitably for South Africa to make the determination, South Africa will be knowing that the rest of Africa is watching.
So let me come back to Ambassador Mbaya here. As Africans awaken, or African leadership and diplomacy awakens, what are the potential implications do you see here?
Well, it's interesting what is coming through, but the point is this. For American president, when he wants to address Asian countries, he goes to Asia. When he wants to address European countries, he goes to Europe. When he wants to address African countries, he summons them to United States. That is the difference. And I think that is where people are beginning to see, to show that there is discrimination in terms of approaches, and therefore what is the justification of looking down, quote unquote, down African presidents. It is a serious matter, and I think the United States needs to really look at itself in the mirror to find out, is that the way to conduct its own foreign policy in Africa? I don't think so. And I think it will realize that there is a problem in terms of perception, and also how far it can reach with that kind of quote-unquote condescending attitude. We don't need to get into a situation where we believe so-and-so is bigger than so-and-so. We are sovereign states. Let us enjoy our sovereignty, and let us also benefit in terms of cooperation by agreeing on structures that will help both countries mutually benefit from those relations.
All right, a very interesting discussion indeed. But on that note, we'll take a short break. And when we come back, we will be looking at broader implications of this shift in diplomacy for international relations. Stay with us.
In terms of a common understanding of governance, the attitude of adult supervision has to be left in the past. Examples of right or wrong conduct can be found everywhere. We must avoid the temptation to reduce Africa to the lowest common denominator with blanket judgments and generalizations. There cannot be a mutually respectful partnership premised on the unspoken assumption that one party lacks values or has defective values, while the other party is a fully formed moral agent.
It assumes Africans are children still. They are not mature. They cannot deal with the world powers. They will be ill-treated and fooled as small kids. That's what it implies. Europeans can deal with Chinese. Maybe they are mature, they will know where to keep them. But since Africans are poor, they will just be bribed and so on.
Welcome back to Talk Africa. Now let's continue with this discussion. Still with me in Nairobi, Ambassador Boaz Mbaya; in Kampala, Joseph Ochieno; and in Johannesburg, J. Brooks Spector. Joseph, let me get to you with this one. We just heard the sentiments by African leaders. Are they now more emboldened because of the multiplicity of options in light of changing global dynamics?
I think they are. And as I was saying, how much better they respond beyond where we are at the moment, and beyond sentiments and beyond some of their own personal experiences in terms of possibly humiliation, so that it does not become emotive, but as I said, rather much more purposeful. as President Mbeki attempted to do a few decades ago, would be important. Yes, of course, things have substantially changed. China is a lead global power and a net alternative in every sense. Russia is reasserting her authority. The European Union is neither here nor there. The United States, yes, remains to be the leading global power, but as I said, United States has quite a lot of cleaning up to do, because lest we forget, and this is very important, that you know, looking back, if you see conversations coming from Pretoria, you remember that some of the leaders from there will be looking back like what Mr. Mandela said: who are you going to teach us to be our friends, and where were you yesterday on some of these foreign policy issues? So it's extremely important. I genuinely hope that African leaders are waking up, and I genuinely hope African leaders are waking up together with their people in the interest of African peoples, and I genuinely hope that it can be about big African thinking in partnership with the rest of the world, rather than picking and choosing.
Ambassador Mbaya, interesting conception there on who is your friend and who's asking you, you know, to be friends with so and so. Ghana's president has also recently questioned that obsession with Africa's engagement with China by, you know, Western partners. What is the concern here and the need to dictate to Africa who Africa should engage with?
Let me put it this way. I think the United States had the opportunity in 1989 at the collapse of the Soviet Union to determine what values the rest of the world would follow. But they blew the chance because they came up with conditionalities and spoke to nations rather than speaking with them. And that actually caused a very huge problem in terms of perception and in terms of acceptability. So what we are trying to look at now is, are we able to continue with the relations with the United States? Yes, is a superpower. Are we able to deal with other countries? Yes, we should deal with other countries. And Africa has adopted a very interesting policy, non-aligned foreign policy, where you pick the best from one side and the other side and make it your own. We don't need to be given blueprints. We have to create our own blueprints for economic development, and also in terms of political relationship, we must be left alone to decide what is good for our own countries.
J. Brooks Spector, your perspective.
Let me say this about meetings in Washington, where African leaders are supposedly summoned to Washington. In my experience and in what I have observed, most leaders in the world, in most countries, whether it is in Africa or Asia or Latin America, enjoy coming to, or enjoy is probably not quite the right word, believe it is beneficial and consequential for them to come to Washington, primarily because there are a multiplicity of national and international organizations that this becomes an opportunity to deal with. It isn't just the executive department of the executive departments of the United States government. Congress matters a great deal, and the congressional staffs matter a great deal. But beyond that, there is the International Monetary Fund, there is the World Bank, there are a variety of other international organizations in Washington and in New York, and brief side trips also allow you to go to the Boston area, where you can engage with a world-class collection of academics and commentators and so forth as well. One trip solves lots of opportunities. And I think, as I have seen in the past, leaders tend to relish that opportunity. As a consequence of circumstances, it is much harder to organize a group except for just a couple of African nations. The smaller countries, it becomes very hard to host a large 50 or 55 group gathering.
So I want to get your view here, Ambassador Mbaya. Is it more of an advantage for African leaders to have their meetings in, for instance, Washington or London, as opposed to in Africa? Your thoughts?
I don't think African leaders are against holding meetings in Washington. It is the manner in which they are treated when they are in Washington. And the argument will be, I've been in the Foreign Office for 40 years. The argument will be, the security will not allow everybody to be driving their own cars. What about the President of the United States? When the Queen Elizabeth died, he was the only one who had a private motorcade. Everybody's security is not an issue for them. So it is that condescending attitude that the United States has, and I think generally the West has, that is causing problems to African leaders. And I can assure you that they are becoming of age. I don't think it's going to be a situation where they're simply going to go because the United States has summoned them. No.
Right. I want to get your winding up comments, and let me start off with you, Joseph. What are we likely to see going forward, though? How do you see African countries balancing assertiveness in their diplomatic engagements in light of the changing global dynamics? I
really hope going forward that African leaders will not only be sufficiently aggressive when it comes to broader strategic African interests, and when they are, that it's not about, if you like, how they as leaders are treated in a condescending way, but broadly African. So therefore, including the case and the circumstance in which an African perhaps is killed, an African dies in New York or Harlem, I would expect an African leader to take a position and to make a loud noise like an Israeli prime minister would, or perhaps even American citizen is injured somewhere in downtown East Lay in Nairobi. But I mean, generally, I think it is fair enough the case that when most Africans actually have, generally most Africans have very, very, very nice and warm regards to the West, warm regards to America. We've got huge historical relationships. In fact, we shouldn't really be having this conversation if you consider our long history of slavery, our long history of forgiving, our long history of looking forward, and our long history of having African populations there. If anything, I'm saying that future African leaders should be looking at creating possibilities for African citizens in the US, in the Caribbean, and elsewhere, to be having visa-free entries on the continent, so that other friends of Africa, who are not necessarily traditionally historical African, should be coming to enjoy this continent. So it's really not about either or. And so while we're having this conversation, so should other nations, India, China, emerging other nations, Russia. We are simply saying we want to be treated as normal global citizens equally, freely and fairly. But quick observation that I hope while we are demanding for this, I call it a demand, that African leaders wake up and stop corruption.
All right, we have to wind up here, but Ambassador Mbaya, what are we likely to see very briefly going forward?
I would like to see a situation where the African countries coordinate their approach to international relations through the African Union. And I think the formation of the African Union helped in a way, because we moved away from an organization of cooperation, which the Organization of African Unity was, to an organization of integration, which is now looking at in what way Africa can actually develop, and also how we can harness whatever resources we have to develop the continent as a whole. Right now, the world is lopsided, because Africa has about 1.4 billion people, yet they don't have a seat in the UN Security Council. So you do not have anybody on the table other than the non-permanent membership that is offered to several regions in Africa to speak for the continent. We actually need to right that wrong. And we also need to right the wrong that other countries look at us as very junior partners in terms of whatever is happening. Sovereignty must be respected for what it is.
Indeed. Thank you all so very much for an insightful discussion here. But that's all we have time for on this edition of Talk Africa. A big thank you to our panel of experts. In Nairobi, Ambassador Boaz Mbaya, former Kenyan ambassador to the African Union and a former permanent secretary in Kenya's Ministry of Foreign Affairs. In Kampala, Joseph Ochieno, African Affairs commentator, and joining us from Johannesburg, J. Brooks Spector, international relations expert and a former U.S. diplomat. Remember, you can be a part of this conversation through our social media platforms on Facebook and Twitter. And you can also watch this and other editions of Talk Africa on our YouTube playlist. Do join us again next week for more Talk Africa. From me, Beatrice Marshall, and the team here in Nairobi. Until next time, bye-bye.